The camera pans slowly over a thick, gray Appalachian fog. A single, skeletal tree stands on a barren hill. A child's laughter echoes faintly, twisted and hollow, cutting through the morning silence. 8 seconds. That's all it takes to glimpse the first thread of a secret no one in Harlan County wanted remembered. In the winter of 1887, a girl named Mercy Calder vanished from the family homestead. No footprints led away. No whispers of her fate reached the town below. Locals claimed they'd seen shadows moving through the fog, figures with elongated limbs and faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. But none dared approach. The Calder family had always seemed peculiar, a lineage whispered about in hushed tones. Descendants of early settlers, they carved their lives into the craggy mountains, cultivating a self-imposed isolation. By day, they appeared devout, attending the chapel at the valley's edge. By night, the homestead emitted unsettling sounds, screams muffled by the howling wind, chains dragging across wooden floors, and the low hum of chants that sounded older than any hymn ever sung in the county. This story is not about folklore or embellished legend. Archival letters, never meant to leave the family's private ledger, hint at something much darker. A carefully hidden system of cruelty, passed down through generations, shrouded in the guise of faith and civility. Mercy was only the first, and her disappearance would mark the beginning of a century-long unraveling of terror that authorities, neighbors, and even clergy refused to confront. By the end of this documentary, you will see the Calder family for what they truly were. A family whose darkness shaped a region, leaving scars etched into the mountains themselves. The Calder family's roots dug deep into the Appalachian soil, intertwined with shadows older than any courthouse record. Jonathan Calder, the patriarch, arrived in Harlan County in 1823, a man of pious demeanor and relentless control. He carried journals filled with meticulous notations, some detailing farm management, others cataloging behaviors of his children in ways that made even the town preacher uncomfortable. Neighbors whispered of his strictness, but nothing could hint at the severity hidden behind closed doors. The Calder estate, perched on a rocky incline, was surrounded by dense forest. It was both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where sunlight barely reached the windows, where the air seemed heavy with the scent of damp earth, ash, and something metallic that no one could name. By 1850, the family had expanded unnaturally fast. Children multiplied, and yet, strange patterns emerged. Infants were sometimes reassigned to older siblings or kept isolated for months at a time, ostensibly for discipline. Visitors occasionally saw children wandering barefoot in the woods, eyes wide and unblinking, murmuring to themselves. Jonathan Calder preached morality, faith, and hard work, but behind locked doors, he tested his children in ways that would haunt generations. The local church, a stone building at the base of the mountain, functioned as both a shield and a collaborator. Calder was a major donor, often sponsoring sermons about sin, repentance, and familial duty. Ministers rarely questioned the family's actions. When a boy went missing in 1861, the preacher suggested he had fallen victim to temptation and dismissed murmurs of foul play. The town obeyed. What began as strictness evolved into ritualized cruelty. Patterns of punishment, isolation, and fear became coded into the family's daily life, as if the mountains themselves approved. By the end of Jonathan's life, the Calder children had been trained not to speak of the family's internal horrors, and a cycle had begun that would persist well into the 20th century. The Calder family chapel was a deceptively serene place. From the outside, it appeared as a modest structure of stone and timber, built in 1842. Sunlight fell across its steeple in golden slants, and hymns echoed through the valley. Inside, however, shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. Candles flickered without wind, and some pews bore grooves, gouges, or stains that no one would explain. Jonathan Calder's sermons emphasized morality, the eternal gaze of God, and the virtue of obedience. But there were whispers, among the children, among the servants, that the chapel held another function. Behind a false panel in the vestry, Jonathan had created a series of small rooms, nearly airtight, where he could observe, isolate, or punish his children and occasional visitors in silence. Families in the valley often sent their children to the Calder Chapel for Sunday school or tutoring, unaware that behind the veneer of piety, terror lurked. Children sometimes returned home with strange behaviors. Vacant stares, murmured prayers that did not match scripture, and nightmares that left deep cuts on their psyche. Those who questioned the family's methods were labeled troublemakers and ostracized. Records indicate that Jonathan meticulously documented every infraction, every episode of disobedience, in his journals. He described punishments in clinical, detached language, detailing the exact duration of isolation, the positioning of chains, and the psychological effect of darkness. These entries reveal a mind consumed by control, a man who equated spiritual righteousness with terror. By the 1880s, the chapel had become both a fortress and a prison, a crucible in which innocence was tested and often broken. Those who dared to approach the Calder estate after sunset rarely returned without stories of shadows, whispers, and faint, echoing cries. The chapel's walls absorbed the terror, turning faith into fear, and visitors left with unease they could neither explain nor forget. Mercy Calder was 12 when she vanished. She was described as quiet, obedient, with an unnerving awareness beyond her years. On the morning of her disappearance, neighbors reported seeing her collecting firewood near the forest's edge. She never returned. Search parties scoured the surrounding woods for weeks. Footprints led into the fog but stopped abruptly near a gnarled tree known as Widow's Watch. The town murmured about spirits, curses, and mountain ghosts. Jonathan Calder offered prayers and donations to the search but never appeared truly concerned. His journal entry from that week reads, "Mercy tests her faith. She will return when ready." Rumors spread of hidden rooms in the house where children were locked for weeks or months. Some suggested Mercy had been taken to one of these chambers. Others whispered of an underground network of tunnels below the Calder homestead, sealed off with heavy timber and stone. Locals who dared approach the property at night spoke of distant wails and lights flickering in windows long after dark. The disappearance ignited fear in the town, but the family remained untouchable. Calder's wealth, influence, and deep ties to the church ensured that authorities never investigated fully. Mercy's siblings were instructed never to speak of her, and the family slowly erased her existence from memory. Yet, the echo of her absence lingered in the mountains, a haunting reminder that some horrors were better left unseen. By the end of the decade, the Calder name had become synonymous with both devotion and dread. Outsiders felt the pull of superstition. Insiders knew the truth. This family hid terrors beneath a polished surface, and Mercy's disappearance was only the beginning. By the 1890s, the Calder homestead had grown into a sprawling compound. Jonathan's influence extended beyond his own bloodline, as orphan children from the surrounding valleys were quietly absorbed into the household. The townsfolk, desperate to place children in good care, assumed the Calders were benevolent. Few noticed the cold, calculating gleam in Jonathan's eyes, the way he studied the children as if they were experiments rather than souls. Inside the homestead, routines were rigid. Children were assigned work, prayer, and study hours with military precision. Failures were punished silently, sometimes with solitary confinement in windowless rooms. The orphan children were particularly vulnerable. They were stripped of names, given numbers, and taught to fear any sign of affection as a possible trap. Some whispered that Jonathan found pleasure in reshaping personalities, erasing wills, and molding obedience like clay. Servants and townspeople occasionally glimpsed disturbing behavior. A child who disobeyed might vanish for days, re-emerging pale, distant, or mute. One woman recalled seeing a line of children kneeling in the yard at dawn, shivering as Jonathan walked among them with a riding crop. Their faces were blank, eyes wide but unseeing. Some of these children would later vanish entirely, leaving only footprints leading into the surrounding forest. Yet outwardly, the family maintained appearances. Guests were greeted warmly, sermons delivered passionately, and donations sent generously to the church. It was a careful dance. Terror behind closed doors, civility in public. Few dared question it, and those who did often found themselves isolated, slandered, or frightened into silence. By the close of the century, the Calder compound had become a machine of control, built on fear and secrecy. Each child brought into the family was another thread in a web no outsider could untangle. The mountains bore witness, absorbing whispers and screams, while the town below remained oblivious, or too afraid to confront what lay hidden in plain sight. The Appalachians themselves seemed complicit in the Calder's secrets. Locals spoke of a persistent wind that carried voices, almost human, through the valleys at night. Some claimed the trees bent unnaturally around the homestead, shadows stretching as if to shield the estate from prying eyes. Travelers reported a heaviness in the air, a sensation of being watched. Jonathan Calder understood this. He leveraged isolation as both protection and weapon. The mountains cut the family off from scrutiny, and rumors ensured that few dared approach. When outsiders tried to investigate disappearances, the land itself seemed to resist. Rain would fall, fog would thicken, and animals vanished or fell silent. It was as if the very soil was consecrated by fear. Children internalized this mythology. Some spoke of a voice in the wind that punished disobedience, an ancestral presence that watched over the family. Others claimed to see figures moving between the trees at night, long-limbed shadows that bent reality and warped perception. Jonathan encouraged these beliefs, using superstition to deepen obedience. Letters from a visiting relative described the estate as a place where time and reason falter, where the very air seems to conspire against you. By the early 1900s, the Calder family had become a near-mythical presence in Harlan County. Respected publicly, feared privately, and shrouded in stories the townsfolk dared not speak aloud. The mountains, the mist, and the hidden rooms all served one purpose: to amplify control, to cement secrecy, and to ensure that the darkness within the Calder line would remain unchallenged. Those who tried to pry too close often disappeared, swallowed by fog, forest, or fear. As the 20th century approached, the Calder family's private practices took on a ritualized aspect. Journals hint at ceremonies conducted in the dead of night, involving children, obscure symbols, and chants older than the family itself. The purpose was framed as spiritual, yet records show a pattern of terror and psychological manipulation, designed to instill obedience through fear rather than devotion. Witnesses were rare, but some servants left cryptic notes about screams echoing through the stone hallways, faces painted with candle soot, and lines of children performing synchronized movements under Jonathan's precise instructions. He believed in a moral hierarchy enforced by ritual, one that justified his cruelty as divine instruction. The church remained blind or complicit. Visiting ministers wrote glowing reports of the family's piety, oblivious to the horrors concealed behind locked doors. Jonathan's manipulation of faith created a veneer of legitimacy, making accusations not only dangerous but almost unthinkable. To challenge him was to challenge God itself. Some older children, however, began to resist, quietly plotting escape or rebellion. Their whispered plans were met with increased scrutiny and punishment, forcing them deeper into silence. By now, the family had perfected the art of psychological domination, blending fear, loyalty, and twisted ritual into a suffocating grip over every life within the homestead. Even townsfolk who once considered themselves brave avoided the Calder estate. Stories of missing children, unexplainable shadows, and distant cries became background noise, a suppressed horror woven into the daily rhythm of Appalachian life. By 1910, the Calder homestead had reached its apex of secrecy and terror. Children grew up in a cycle of fear, some vanishing entirely, leaving siblings with hollow stares and hushed whispers. The pattern was methodical, one generation disappearing, the next molded by ritual and control. Families in the valley began to fear the very mention of the Calder name, and local authorities seemed powerless or unwilling to intervene. Archival letters suggest that Jonathan's grandson, Elias Calder, maintained the same practices, albeit more covertly. He kept journals in code, detailing punishments, disappearances, and strange exercises meant to strengthen obedience. Older children were often forced to care for the younger ones, creating a hierarchy of terror where cruelty became normalized and internalized. Neighbors occasionally reported seeing children moving in single file into the forest, returning hours later with no memory of where they had been. Some spoke of faint wails carried down the valleys, but the mountains obscured both vision and sound. The homestead itself became a labyrinth of hidden rooms, secret passages, and sealed attics, each space meticulously catalogued in Elias's notes. Visitors who approached the estate for charity work or religious guidance often left with a profound unease, describing unnatural shadows and whispers, windows glowing when no candles were lit. The mountains seemed to swallow the estate into a permanent twilight, amplifying the family's dominion over both land and psyche. By now, the Calder name had become almost mythic. Stories of missing children, shadowed corridors, and midnight rituals circulated quietly, but the truth remained inaccessible. The disappearing generation was both a warning and a testament. The Calder family's cruelty was engineered to endure, leaving scars invisible to outsiders but indelible to those who survived. Throughout the decades, the Calder family maintained a careful alliance with local clergy. Generous donations and public displays of faith ensured that few dared question their private conduct. Sermons lauded obedience, morality, and devotion, while hidden horrors thrived behind the estate's walls. One minister, writing in 1923, described a Calder child as a bright and devout youth, blissfully unaware that the boy had spent weeks locked in a small chamber beneath the chapel. Jonathan and Elias leveraged religious authority to validate terror, creating a system where questioning the family equaled questioning God. Occasional letters from visiting church members hint at suspicions. One reads, "There is something off, a weight in the air that no sermon can lift." Yet fear, financial dependency, and social pressure ensured silence. The church's blind eye became an instrument of complicity, cementing the Calder family's impunity and allowing the cycle of cruelty to continue unhindered. By the mid-1920s, the community had divided into two groups: those who whispered of shadows and disappearances and those who publicly upheld the family's pious image. Both feared reprisal, and the mountains amplified the family's influence, hiding the estate from scrutiny and swallowing dissent into silence. Inside the Calder homestead, one wing became known among surviving children as the Hall of Shadows. Long, narrow, and windowless, it stretched for what felt like endless corridors. Candles flickered along the walls, casting elongated shapes that seemed alive. Children were forced to walk in silence, step after step, memorizing rituals and incantations under Elias Calder's strict supervision. The hall itself was a psychological weapon. Walls were painted with symbols of penance and obedience. Mirrors reflected distorted images of those who entered, amplifying fear and self-doubt. Any hesitation, any misstep, was punished in ways that left invisible scars on both body and mind. Servants occasionally left notes describing the eerie sounds that emerged from the hall at night. Whispers in languages no one understood, doors creaking open by themselves, and children's cries that cut through the foggy silence of the mountains. Outsiders were warned away, convinced the family's estate was cursed. The Hall of Shadows became a symbol of the Calder dynasty's control, a labyrinth of fear where obedience was enforced with unrelenting psychological precision. By the 1930s, even the eldest family members admitted, in hushed tones, that the hall was a place from which no one returned the same. By 1935, the Calder homestead had absorbed dozens of orphan children from surrounding counties. These children, often left unclaimed due to poverty or illness, became invisible instruments of control. Names were stripped, histories erased, and memories reshaped to serve the family's rigid hierarchy. Survivors spoke of daily routines that resembled military drills. Sleep, prayer, work, and punishment were scheduled with clockwork precision. Deviations were met with silent confinement, forced kneeling, or exposure to the Hall of Shadows. Some children vanished for weeks, reappearing with vacant eyes, traumatized beyond recognition. Letters from distant relatives reveal a terrifying reality. The Calders kept meticulous records of each child's behavior, their fears cataloged, their weaknesses exploited. Punishment became a tool of experimentation, and the mountains provided perfect cover. Locals whispered that the estate had grown beyond human comprehension, a self-contained ecosystem where fear thrived. Despite whispers, no official intervention occurred. Authorities were distant, and townsfolk feared both retaliation and scandal. The forgotten orphans became living testaments to a system designed to erode innocence, leaving a psychological imprint that would persist for generations. The Appalachian fog was more than weather. It was a companion to the Calder family's cruelty. At night, thick clouds rolled through the valleys, muffling sound and distorting light. Children recounted waking to strange shapes moving through the mist, voices calling their names in unfamiliar tones. Some survivors reported seeing figures with elongated shadows pacing the forest edges, eyes glowing faintly, always watching. Others described dreams where they relived punishments, screams echoing endlessly, corridors stretching beyond comprehension. The fog blurred the line between reality and nightmare, ensuring obedience through both fear and confusion. Visitors noted the oppressive stillness. Animals avoided the Calder homestead. Winds carried eerie whispers that seemed to originate from no discernible source. The family leveraged these environmental elements to instill terror, teaching children that escape was not only impossible but unimaginable. By the 1940s, the fog had become an integral part of the Calder mythology. It was said to hide sins and punish disobedience, a spectral guardian of secrets too monstrous for daylight. Those who dared enter rarely spoke again, their experiences preserved only in trembling whispers among surviving townsfolk. Among the Calder family archives was a ledger hidden beneath loose floorboards. Entries chronicled disappearances, punishments, and rituals with chilling precision. Names were crossed out, dates circled, and annotations added in margins with almost surgical clarity. The ledger was more than a record, it was a blueprint of control. Jonathan and later Elias documented every child's fears, every misstep, every response to isolation. The language was clinical yet grotesquely intimate, revealing a mind obsessed with dominion. Historians who later discovered fragments of the ledger noted its eerie blend of mundane accounting and horrific experimentation. Payments for repairs sat next to detailed descriptions of confinement chambers, chains, and chanting. The ledger embodied the family's philosophy: meticulous, methodical, and monstrously efficient. Possession of the ledger was a secret passed only to the eldest family members. It ensured continuity, teaching each generation how to maintain the terror without external interference. Its pages were sacred, feared, and invisible to outsiders, a final testament to the Calder dynasty's mastery of control. In 1942, Elias Calder disappeared. Unlike the children, his disappearance was met with confusion and whispered speculation. Some claimed he had been consumed by the very rituals he perfected, others that the mountains had claimed him. Investigators who attempted to search the estate were deterred by dense fog, treacherous terrain, and stories of ghosts that haunted corridors. No body was ever recovered. His journals hinted at paranoia, guilt, and obsession, suggesting that even the master of fear could not escape the consequences of a lifetime spent weaving terror. The disappearance marked a turning point. The estate became quieter, almost dormant. The children and orphans who survived the early decades began to emerge from secrecy, haunted but alive, carrying memories that the mountains themselves seemed to whisper in their ears. Even after the Calder estate fell into partial ruin, stories persisted. Locals told of shadows flitting behind broken windows, distant screams on foggy nights, and strange figures appearing in mirrors. Travelers reported fleeting glimpses of children walking in single file through the mist, eyes empty, mouths whispering forgotten prayers. Archival records indicate the family continued to maintain secrecy even after Elias vanished. Letters speak of coded communication with relatives, preserving rituals and memories of vanished children. The Calder legacy endured through silence, a spectral echo embedded in the valleys themselves. The mountains bore witness to generations of cruelty. Over time, trees twisted unnaturally around the homestead, streams ran red with iron-rich soil, and fog perpetually clung to the Calder estate. The land itself seemed to remember, a living memorial to terror and control. Those who lived nearby spoke of unease, sickness, and inexplicable fears. Even decades later, the valleys held a shadow, a psychological imprint left by centuries of manipulation, ritual, and disappearance. A handful of children survived the Calder legacy. They recounted horrors in hushed tones. Isolation, ritual, and forced obedience. Many fled the mountains as teenagers, carrying deep psychological scars. Their stories, collected in letters and oral histories, reveal the meticulous cruelty and ritualized terror the family inflicted. These survivors provided rare insight into the daily life of the estate, the mechanics of fear, and the calculated nature of control. They were living proof of the human cost of the Calder dynasty. The Calder family was effectively erased from public records. Newspapers occasionally mentioned missing children, but fear and the family's influence ensured silence. Historians largely ignored the valley, dismissing rumors as folklore. The result was historical amnesia, a deliberate forgetting of horrors that should never have been concealed. Only fragments survived: journals, letters, and oral histories. Piecing them together reveals a disturbing pattern, one that implicates not just the family but the institutions that enabled them: the church, the local authorities, and the townsfolk who chose compliance over inquiry. Even today, the Calder estate remains cloaked in fog, a symbol of secrets too deep for sunlight. Explorers report a feeling of being watched, whispers that vanish when you strain to hear them, and corridors that seem longer than reality allows. The land preserves the memory of cruelty, a living monument to control, fear, and ritualized terror. The fog is a guardian, concealing truths the mountains refuse to release. Anyone who enters carries with them a fragment of that terror, a reminder that some horrors are eternal, surviving beyond the lives that first unleashed them. The Calder family's legacy is not just history. It is a lesson in the capacity for human cruelty when veiled by faith, secrecy, and isolation. Mountains, mist, and memory carry the echoes of vanished children, terrified orphans, and adults who perfected terror. Their story is a warning. Silence can be weaponized, institutions can be complicit, and evil can flourish in plain sight when fear governs obedience. Though the family is gone, the valleys remember. The fog, the shadows, and the mountains themselves preserve a secret the world is not meant to know, and perhaps should never forget.